Hello, I'm Jeff Van Treese, and this is Mobilized News. We welcome you to our show. As our guest today is Professor Jonathan Feingold. Jonathan is a law professor at Boston University, and he specializes in the area of civil rights, critical race theory, affirmative action, and has written a number of articles on that subject. And he also is the host of the podcast Race Class, which is available wherever you get your podcasts. So, Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Jeff. Real pleasure to be here.
So let's just start out. The Supreme Court, as we know, just heard oral arguments on several affirmative action cases. One was against Harvard, and one was against North Carolina. In what some might have found surprising, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson recently recused herself because she worked for Harvard at one point and was, although not involved in the admissions process, gave strategic advice to the Harvard admissions team, and so she recused herself. Something some other justices haven't done when it might have been appropriate to do so. But we look at the math; the numbers look like it's pretty overwhelming with this far right Supreme Court that these are probably going to be struck down, and affirmative action at least will be curtailed in some significant manner. So what can we brace ourselves for? What are we looking at in terms of assuming that what we expect to happen does happen in the Supreme Court? How will that change the landscape?
Thanks, Jeff. It's a good question. I think first we can expect that at least 5 justices will further curtail public and private universities' rights to consider the race of individual applicants in the admissions process. And that would require overturning well-settled precedent. And so anyone who recalls, it was only 2016 when the Supreme Court most recently heard a case along these lines. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg, after the case, said, it's the last time that we are going to confront this sort of case. And it was the second time in just a couple of decades that the Supreme Court had actually reaffirmed the right of universities to consider an applicant's race to produce a robust student body diversity. And so the only thing that's really changed since now and then is the composition of the court. And as a function of Donald Trump getting elected and then having the really fortuitous opportunity to appoint a number of quite right-wing justices, you now have a different makeup on the court. And so regardless of well-established precedent and regardless of really the modest consideration of race that is even considered now, we're going to have a new law, very likely on the books, that prohibits universities from formally considering the racial identity of individual students. And I want to, zoom out a little bit to sort of contextualize what's happening. Affirmative action, the sort of policy that Harvard or UNC is currently engaging in, really, I think we can think about as a very, very modest way to actually reduce the relevance of race in the admissions process. Because if you just recognize that racism is structural and that race really shapes pretty much every aspect of our public and private lives in the United States, it means that if you don't account for race, certain students, as a function of their racial identity, will inevitably enjoy what we would think of as a racial bonus or racial boost. And it's only by accounting for that that you can promote a more meritorious, individualized admissions process. And so it might be a little counterintuitive, but by taking off the table the ability of a place like Harvard or UNC to simply account for a student's racial identity, it's going to be internalizing within the admissions process a racial advantage for students who have the most inherited racial advantage, which in this country tends to be white students.